Houston was not able to control his state. Delegates from Texas attended the later session of a General Congress of the seceding states, which, on the invitation of Alabama, met at Montgomery on the 4th of February. A contemporary document of singular interest today is the series of resolutions adopted by the legislature of North Carolina, setting forth that, as the state was a member of the Federal Union, it could not accept the invitation of Alabama, but should send delegates for the purpose of persuading the South to effect a readjustment on the basis of the Crittenden Compromise as modified by the legislature of Virginia. The commissioners were sent, were graciously received, were accorded seats in the Congress, but they exerted no influence on the course of its action. The Congress speedily organized a provincial government for the Confederate States of America. The Constitution of the United States, rather hastily reconsidered, became, with a few inevitable alterations, the Constitution of the Confederacy. Davis was unanimously elected President, Stevens Vice President. Provision was made for raising an army. Commissioners were dispatched to Washington to negotiate a treaty with the United States. Other commissioners were sent to Virginia to attempt to withdraw that great commonwealth from the Union. To the observer of a later age, this document appears a thing of haste. Like the framers of the Constitution of 1787, who omitted from their document some principles which they took for granted, the framers of 1861 left unstated their most distinctive views. The basal idea upon which the Revolution proceeded, the right of secession, is not to be found in the new Constitution. Though the preamble declares that the states are acting in their sovereign and independent character, the new Confederation is declared permanent. In the body of the document are provisions similar to those in the Federal Constitution, enabling a majority of 2/3 of the state to amend at their pleasure, thus imposing their will upon the minority. With 3 notable exceptions, the new Constitution, subsequent to the preamble, does little more than restate the Constitution of 1787, rearranged so as to include those basal principles of the English law added to the earlier Constitution by the first 8 amendments. The 3 exceptions are the prohibitions, number 1, of the payment of bounties, number 2, of the levying of duties to promote any one form of industry, and number 3, of appropriations for internal improvements. Here was a monument to the battle over these matters in the Federal Congress. As to the mechanism of the new government, it was the same as the old, except for a few changes of detail. The presidential term was lengthened to 6 years, and the president was forbidden to succeed himself. The president was given the power to veto items in appropriation bills, the African slave trade was prohibited. The Upper South was thus placed in a painful situation. Its sympathies were with the seceding states. Most of its people felt also that if coercion was attempted, the issue would become, for Virginia and North Carolina, no less than for South Carolina and Alabama, simply a matter of self-preservation. As early as January, in the exciting days when Floyd's resignation was being interpreted as a call to arms, the Virginia legislature had resolved that it would not consent to the coercion of a seceding state. In May, the Speaker of North Carolina assured a commissioner from Georgia that North Carolina would never consent to the movement of troops from or across the state to attack a seceding state. But neither Virginia nor North Carolina in this second stage of the movement wanted to secede. They wanted to preserve the Union. But along with the Union, they wanted the principle of local autonomy. It was a period of tense anxiety in those states of the Upper South. The frame of mind of the men who loved the Union, but who loved equally their own states, and were firm for local autonomy, is summed up in a letter in which Mrs. Robert E. Lee describes the anguish of her husband as he confronted the possibility of a divided country. The real tragedy of the time lay in the failure of the advocates of these two great principles, each so necessary to a far-flung democratic country in a world of great powers, the failure to coordinate them so as to ensure freedom at home and strength abroad. The principle for which Lincoln stood has saved Americans in the Great War from playing such a trembling part as that of Holland. The principle which seemed to Lee even more essential, which did not perish at Appomattox, but was transformed and not destroyed, is what has kept us from becoming a Western Prussia. And yet, if only it had been possible to coordinate the two without the price of war. It was not possible because of the stored-up bitterness of a quarter-century of recrimination. But Virginia made a last desperate attempt to preserve the Union by calling the Peace Convention. It assembled at Washington the day the Confederate Congress met at Montgomery. Though 21 states sent delegates, it was no more able to effect a working scheme of compromise than was the House Committee of 33 or the Senate Committee of 13, both of which had failed and had gone their ways to the place of the great company of historic futilities.